Okay, so just as an element of disclosure, I should be doing this every time. You should know that you probably do, that the classes are recorded. So they record anything said. They usually record the video as well. So just make sure you're aware that everything you say or do, or grimace or whatever, is there for posterity. So I had some thoughts I wanted to share with you from our last week's class. I mentioned that I was rather surprised after Sydney told me about the community on James Bay, the Cree community that she spent time in last summer, Wiminji. And I'd mentioned at the class that when I looked it up on Google Maps, I didn't find it. It wasn't there. And so, as I often do, and as my wife often complains that I get carried away sometimes, I went out and looked for something that would give me a better geographical understanding of Indigenous communities in Canada. And I'm going to share a screen with you. So what I happened to find was an atlas put out by the Royal Canadian Geographic Society called the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. It's a 4-volume production, wonderful information, many maps, but more than maps, it has all sorts of information about background to understanding Indigenous culture throughout Canada. And when I say it was published by the Royal Canadian Geographical Society of Canada, it was done in conjunction with, and this is crucial, with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the Assembly of First Nations, the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, the Métis National Council, and an organization called Inspire. So I mention this because we talking about, Brenda, you mentioned before about the Canadian flag. When we understand Canada, we have a certain image of maps of Canada broken up into provinces as designated around Confederation, and of course in the decades following, as more provinces were accepted into the Dominion. But we don't often take a look at what would that map have looked like before first contact, before Canada was Canada, before Upper and Lower Canada existed, before the area known as Quebec existed, before the Northwest area existed. So I took the liberty of adding a map that I'd like to share with you. So if you look at this map, yes, it does have the provincial lines, and you'll probably recognize this. You've got Hudson Bay up here and James Bay down here. And over here is Wiminji, the community that Sydney visited and shared very honestly and openly and wonderfully with us about her experience last summer. And I'm not the kind of person who is really spooked by inexplicable and enigmatic coincidences, but, and I'm not sure you're going to believe me when I tell you this, but when I pulled out one of the 4 volumes and I opened it opened up exactly on the page with Wiminji. I'd never opened the set before. It came from Amazon, came in the mail. I opened up that first volume and there was Wiminji there. So whatever that means, I don't know, but there's something perhaps fateful about our discussions and the connection with trying to understand a little bit more about other narratives. And I'm not suggesting you go out and buy this set of atlases, although it gives a fascinating account based on where the various Indigenous, however we refer to them, First Nations peoples lived in Canada. And it talks about an area, as you can see here, we have the border between Quebec and Ontario, but when you look at the description of the various nations, and here you see really only the Cree and Nunavut, it doesn't give any borders. There were really no borders, fixed borders. It was a moving, transitional type of existence for many of these nations. Yes, they lived in certain areas, but they weren't fixed by borders. They crossed each other's borders, they traded, they didn't see ownership of the land as something that was specifically defined per tribe, per community, per nation, although those borders did exist to a certain extent, but were never marked on a map. It was something that was in their culture, an understanding of who would fish, who would use each area, each territory. And it's only the fixed borders that come in later on. And you see the names of all the different nations, Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, Inuit, etc. And it's a fascinating look at how a map can be interpreted in different ways. You mentioned before, Sharon, about a bag of carrots. Yeah, we can interpret all our experience, our visual experience in various ways. And maps are such a powerful way of defining how we see our place in this world, and specifically in Canada. So I would urge you, as I had said, not necessarily to buy the set, but look and see, take a look at some of the maps that reflect the indigenous experience, even today, but certainly before first contact, before Europeans, French or British or others came and began to settle Canada. So that's just a little bit of a reflection on what we talked about last week, but it connects very much to what I wanted to talk about today. Because when we look at this week's Parsha, and I'm going to go off tangentially fairly far from the Parsha, but in addition to everything that's going on in this week's Parsha, the red heifer, the famous scene of Moses hitting the rock rather than talking to it, the death of Miriam, the death of Aaron, it also talks about the efforts of the Israelites to enter the Promised Land, first asking permission from a relative, the Edomites, and when they're denied permission, they don't go into their land. They accept that refusal and move on. And there's some other incidents as well. And then it gets to their requests of Sichon Melech Amori, the Amorites. And of course, what happens there is they do ask initially, but when their request is refused, they don't go around and try another option. They conquer those peoples, they wipe them out, and they continue on. And the same thing happens with Og Melech HaBashan. And interestingly, in next week's Parsha, it actually refers to the cradle of Og, who was considered this giant, and the cradle is stored, not in these words, in some museum. It's in a place where people can see it. So there's this relic of Og Melech HaBashan. And it got me thinking a little bit about what do we do when we remove those who were there before, or where we don't agree with the narrative of those who came before us, or with those who exist now? What happens if we want to change our view? What happens if we don't want to have remnants that remind us of things that perhaps we might be embarrassed about, or things that we may have seen as a challenge and a threat to us in the past? And if you look at the book of Deuteronomy in Dvarim, it says very, very clearly, when we enter the Promised Land, and this is after conquering and destroying the Amorites with Sichon and Og Melech HaBashan, when we enter the Promised Land on the western side of the Jordan River, we're instructed to wipe out the people there. For the most part. Some of them we can conquer, some of them can be treated as slaves or servants, but others are supposed to be wiped out, and all remnants of their culture need to be wiped out as well. And perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised later on when we explore what's happening during the time of the kings, a couple of centuries later, that certain areas of worship continue to be used, and it's often offered as a criticism of those kings that they allowed those places of foreign, of idol worship to continue to be used. And the prophets are always lambasting the kings for not getting rid of them. Even if a king was relatively good, it always says, Rak habamot lo saru. Just the high places remain, those high places where people feel a need to come into communion with God. It's not enough the temple, they got to go to a tree on the top of a hill, a rock standing out above the other mountains around it. That's where they feel that they need to commune with God, whoever that God is. And if they need to do it with the help of an idol, they do that. And so that went on. But it was always our instruction to wipe out, to destroy those places. And so I began thinking, how does that connect to what's going on today? Take a look at the movement in the last number of years, and especially in the last few months, to consider monuments that we feel threaten our identity, or monuments that we feel negate the values that we'd like to believe our community, our nation, our world, our globe stand for today. And so I thought we would take a little bit of a look at how we are coping with dealing with monuments that come into question, because it brings up begins us a fascinating issue, and I'll explore this a little bit later after we take some examples. Every time something changes, and every time we decide to do something else with admiring and expressing that admiration through statues, through names of streets, does it mean that if something was done that doesn't exactly reflect where we are today, that it should be removed, it should be destroyed? Is that the best and appropriate way to deal with some of these issues, with some of these monuments, with some of these relics, perhaps, of a period which doesn't exactly reflect where we are today ethically or morally? So I'm not asking you to answer that today, right now, but I want you to consider that as we look at some of these monuments that I'm trying to explore in what we've often done, certainly in the States, where things have really started to become a bit of a tempest in that sense recently, in Canada and in Israel, and how all these different societies, we can't go around the world and do it all, although we could if we had time, but how these societies, how these nations deal with the past that maybe they want to disconnect from, they want to separate from. And in fact, if they do, is that the right thing? Does this removal, destruction, the appropriate way to do things? So I'm going to go back to my share screen. Okay, can everybody see the screen? I can't see your response, but just let me know if there's a problem. Hopefully it's on. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these events. Hopefully this works. There we go. All right. Anyone recognize that statue? You can put it in the chat box. So this is Saddam Hussein. I said I was going to talk about Canada, the United States, and Israel, but we'll just take a look at some examples of this toppling of statues that we're very familiar with from the last number of years, especially with media. So if you recall, when Iraq was invaded, one of the first things people felt a need to do was destroy the statue of somebody who had oppressed and abused large parts of the population, if not the entire nation, with the exception of his family and officers and the elite. So one of the first things they did was topple the statue of Saddam Hussein. And you're familiar with many others. You recall a couple of decades ago already, Lenin, who was the hero of the Soviet Union for so many decades, even when the time came in the early 90s, with glasnost and perestroika, and of course the dissolution of the Soviet Union, people there began to take another look, or I would say it was a look and a certain understanding that most people have had probably there for decades, but never had the empowerment, the opportunity to do it without serious threat to their safety and security, if not their lives. So getting rid of Lenin, who was viewed by many as a dictator that harmed the Soviet people in many different ways, this was the result. And Lenin, of course, wasn't the only one. Stalin, his statues were toppled, and not only Stalin, but many others were thrown down to make a statement about this past that people wanted to try to put behind them. Last week, we talked about not so much statues, but we talked about what happens when we want to change names. And I mentioned that Columbus Day is now a day whose name is being changed in different places to reflect greater sensitivity to the people who Columbus discovered here with America back in 1492. The fact that somebody discovers something that already exists reflects a very ethnocentric perspective, and that's not something that people want to continue to tolerate, at least in many circles in the United States. So here's a statue of Christopher Columbus beheaded, head taken off. So different ways of expressing that dissatisfaction with how we've interpreted our history. This wonderful discoverer, explorer, Christopher Columbus, perhaps we need to take a different look. And when we look at these historical figures, we often, I'm not going to go into it so much now, but we often look at them as only in a single dimension. What did Christopher Columbus do? What do we know about him? He discovered America, of course, mostly through the Caribbean. But if we look at some of his deeds, he was in favor of the eradication, the elimination of the people who lived in what became Hispaniola, meaning annihilating them. So we don't think of that because we think of discovering America, the most significant event, perhaps, of the late 15th century. But when we look into some of these figures, we find that there are other elements and other aspects of their identity that perhaps are not the ones we would like to identify with. So perhaps this is an expression of not just the negation of the existence of indigenous peoples here in the Americas, but perhaps a deeper look at who this person was beyond what we've always seen as the discoverer of America. And things in the States, of course, are completely wrapped up with Black Lives Matter and how the view of the South and slavery as it existed there for hundreds of years is viewed. And one way of trying to enhance that discussion is to look at how the South, where slavery existed for so long, how it continues to view those who led the nation in a struggle which, among other things, there may be of constitutional issues as well and states' rights, etc. But at the bottom, there was the need and the expressed goal of maintaining slavery. And so, whereas we've often, I don't know about we in Canada, but certainly people in the South have often seen General Robert E. Lee as a hero, somebody who led bravely what was perhaps to be undeniably a losing fight no matter what he did. Beyond the fact that he was a war hero, he was there helping to perpetuate something which, of course, today to us, if not to some of those people at the time, was abhorrent: slavery, the institution of slavery. And so if you look at statues, this one is perhaps the most famous one in Richmond, Virginia. If you look at statues from 10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, a few years ago, beautifully clean, white limestone, pristine condition, as is the rider and the horse on top. But if you look what today is on the statue, something would never have been tolerated without fining, imprisonment, who knows, of those who might have perpetrated that type of act. But there's no problem today with police and authorities leaving all that graffiti and cursing on what is perhaps the most venerable hero of the American Civil War. I want to show you one other picture if I can access it. I couldn't copy it, but I want to show you this because it was a wonderful view in much greater detail of the graffiti there. So if you'll bear with me just for a moment, let's see if I can get this on screen. Okay, does everyone see that picture? That's a photo taken of the statue that I just showed you a moment ago in Richmond, but from a drone directly above the statue. Look at what has gone on the steps of the statue, which you can't really see from the other photo I gave you. And all this, of course, is tolerated. And beyond that, there was discussion in the Virginia legislature, state legislature, about removing that statue, which is a huge step. For us, probably incomprehensible, about removing the statue to the greatest hero of the South because it's no longer appropriate. And furthermore, there were talks of putting up, if not here and other places, a statue of Arthur Ashe, if you recall, somebody who fought for black rights, a famous tennis player. in the 1970s and 1980s, a black tennis player who's no longer alive, unfortunately, but putting up a statue of Arthur Ashe, which more accurately reflects fight for civil rights, for equality, etc. So this is a reality that people in the States are facing. How do we deal with this? Does it make sense to remove that statue? I'll come back to that question. I'm just going to go back and share the other slideshow we had. Okay, so that's Robert E. Lee. Something that touches home, perhaps a little more for many young people. I can't say how many young people fully identify with Robert E. Lee and the Civil War, but if you look at one of the better known football teams in the United States in the South, the Ole Miss Rebels. So this idea that, and we talked about the red men in Canada, how that's inappropriate in light of some association with Indigenous people. But you have a football team that prides itself on a name that reflects, perhaps as much as anything else, the fact that the South rebelled against the Union back in 1861 and stood for, as I said, the perpetuation of slavery in the South. So does it make sense? Is it problematic in your opinion? I'll leave it rhetorical for now, that a football team, contemporary football team, that may not be the greatest team, it doesn't matter, it's not Alabama, but a football team calls itself the Ole Miss Rebels. And perhaps look at the colors of the school uniform. So it's blue and red and some white, as often had. This is a game at Ole Miss, at their campus. And so Ole Miss Rebels, what would you do other than, if you're identifying with rebels, why would you not want to show and demonstrate the Confederate flag, which is the symbol of the rebellion of the South against the North, although they didn't see it as rebellion. They saw it as protecting their rights, of course. So does it make sense to perpetuate the name of a team which can only cause friction between those who see it as something that's inappropriate and those who want to perpetuate the memory of a period of time which has been somewhat romanticized, probably not fully understood by many people who wave those flags. I don't know what their ideological commitment and convictions are, but I would dare to say, as with many cases and many causes, many of them don't fully understand the significance and the meaning of those symbols to the greatest extent. And of course, there's talk, as you heard, at NASCAR, the National Association of Speed Car Racing in the United States, of banning Confederate flags from the races. Many of the races take place at southern venues where many of the people who attend have that affiliation, that association, that connection with the idea of the South. And Confederate flags have been waved, and you probably heard about the instance with the black driver who was threatened, et cetera, among other things. And so this movement now to try to get rid of these symbols, which only cause pain for so many millions of people in the United States, does that make sense? Does it make sense to completely get rid of those symbols of the Confederacy, to get rid of statues of all those who were leaders? Statue of Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the South, was also torn down recently. Lee's has not yet been, but probably going that way. So that's the United States, and there's a lot going on there. We'll come back when we talk a little bit more generally about that. But the challenge in the United States is often, among other things, how this ideology and commitment to the idea of the South, the Confederacy, this unique identity that many in the South feel they have, how that impacts upon certainly people in the South, mainly blacks, but also on the nation in terms of how the nation would like to see itself. And it's very problematic, to say the least. And it's a testament and tribute to the people today who finally feel empowered to do something about it, to go out there and deface statues, tear them down, and come out with laws and suggestions in the legislature to eliminate those symbols of what they see as an abhorrent past. You're probably familiar as well with this. Anyone recognize who this is? Probably not, but this took place in Bristol, in England. This is a statue of somebody by the name of Colston, from Edward Colston from the 18th century, who was somebody who dealt in slaves. And therefore, with all the movements of Black Lives Matter around the world, his statue was torn down because he was involved in the slave trade and the institution of slavery in Britain. Of course, Britain, you know, outlawed slavery and banned slave trading in 1804, well before the Civil War. However, many wealthy businessmen and financiers in England continued to fund and support the slavery institution by putting up bonds, which was necessary when people wanted to trade and sell slaves on their so-called slave stock market back before the Civil War. And so, interestingly, although it was not legal and accepted in Britain, when it came to making money, many of those wealthy people continued to be involved. Let's come home. John A. Macdonald. If we were to explore our first Prime Minister's involvement in what was going on with Indigenous people, we would probably come across a history that's not so favorable. And therefore, this is in Montreal, where the statue of Macdonald's has been defaced. Another one shows paint on red hands, meaning he has blood on his hands, for the policies promoted with regards to Indigenous peoples in Canada. And in 2018, a statue of Macdonald was pulled down that stood in front of the Victoria City Hall in British Columbia. So even in our own country, we're starting to take a look at how we view historical figures and what their involvement was with regards to Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, with regards to slavery, etc. And we're starting to face a history that isn't perhaps as glorified as we learned in grade school or in high school, and perhaps even in university not too many years or decades ago. So this willingness to explore how we venerate and consider our leaders, both historical and current, I think is a fascinating event. We laughed, I would say, we were humored when statues of Stalin, Saddam Hussein, and Lenin were torn down. And we said to ourselves, yeah, look at those horrible dictators. Look at the way the people view their leaders from the past. We probably wouldn't have dreamt when we saw those statues torn down 10, 20, 25 years ago in the Soviet Union, in Iraq, that anything like that might ever happen in Canada. And I would not dare to compare John A. Macdonald with Saddam Hussein or with Stalin in terms of direct impact and annihilation of millions of people. Yet, it's not perhaps a quantitative examination we need to do, it's a qualitative one. If we find and learn about our leaders who did things that are not in line with our morals and our values today, then we need to be willing to explore that. Is the answer tearing down their statues everywhere, eradicating any trace of their contribution, the father of our nation, contributing to our society and the development of an entity known as Canada? Again, that's an interesting question. And there are others in Canadian history. This is a statue anyone recognize? Unless you've seen the picture before, this is a statue of Cornwallis being removed from its pedestal in Halifax not long ago, because Cornwallis also offered a policy for dealing with the Mi'kmaq Indigenous peoples in the maritime provinces in terms of their elimination, annihilation, payment for getting rid of them. So even though he's somebody who's considered an important figure in the development of Nova Scotia and the maritime provinces, still, when we explore some of their policies with regards to Indigenous peoples, they're problematic. And the demand to remove such statues continues to this day. Cornwallis is just another example. Anybody recognize this statue? This one, I'll give you a second. So you just take yourself off mute and tell me who you think it is.
Pierre Trudeau?
No.
No.
Not Trudeau?
You should only look that good.
Yeah, right.
Trudeau? No, I'm talking about Pierre, the father. He
Right.
loves
No.
No, that's
It's not Pierre. It's not Pierre either. Anyone
statue
know
was
who
at
it
Queen's
is?
Park.
It's in Queen's Park. You got it. Who is it?
Oh,
Is it Ted Roosevelt?
No. This is a Canadian. This is not a Canadian figure, but this is something that's associated with Canada's identity.
Isn't
this
it
is
George the Fifth?
King Edward VII.
Oh, okay.
Edward the Seventh. Okay, he was king before George V. Okay.
So King Edward VII, again, somebody who is associated with the British Empire and perhaps not the most favorable of policies. Interesting story about this statue. This statue was unveiled in Delhi, in India, commemorating his passing as Emperor of India. But India, when it became independent, decided to dump the statue. They didn't want that anymore. That had nothing to do with their history in terms of independence. It was simply a reflection and an association with a colonial experience. And somehow it made its way to Canada, to Toronto. But again, nothing that Canadians are in any hurry to get rid of, but something that was not wanted by others and dumped on Canada. And interestingly, Canada has this fascination with royalty, as I don't need to tell you. A statue of Queen Victoria was removed from the Irish Parliament many, many years ago as well. So different nations have different associations with royalty. Canada continues to have a favorable connection with royalty, even if it's more of one with the younger generation, but certainly an admiration many Canadians feel. I would say many Canadians don't feel that connection. But interestingly, the Assembly of First Nations has stated that there are important fiduciary ties between to the Crown, dating to the famous Royal Proclamation of 1763, and they're not so sure they want to disregard all connection to royalty and to this colonial past, as painful as it was, which was just fascinating. And I'll come back to that issue in a moment. Okay, I don't know if any of you have heard, but there is a motion to change the name of Dundas Street, because Lord Dundas was somebody who did not favor the immediate abolition of slavery in terms of what was going on in the United States. And they feel that anybody who tried to postpone, delay the full abolition, want to do it in incremental stages, that person perhaps is also not somebody that reflects our values today. So there's a move to change the name of Dundas Street, believe it or not. So in Canada, as a matter of fact, there's also a move to change the name of Russell Street. Somebody else who had similar issues with the acceptance of abolition and the incremental removal of it, as opposed to completely in favor of abolition of slavery, et cetera. So even in Canada, even in Toronto, this idea of Black Lives Matter has affected the way we relate to people in our past who may have been involved as well in the residential schools. Egerton Ryerson, after whom Ryerson University is named, had a connection as well with establishing and coming up with some kind of policies, not necessarily the most negative policies, with the residential schools. And so should even the slightest connection with that horrible institution be something that demands their removal of name from either a street or from an institution? So this is a very, very troubling question in terms of how we deal with remnants of our history that today seem rather unfavorable. So I'm going to jump across the ocean now for a moment. So in Israel, they've developed a very different way of dealing with statues. So this is a statue of a member of the Supreme Court of Justice in Israel, Miriam Naor. So somebody put up this golden statue. Why gold? Any idea? Because perhaps it reflects the idea of the golden calf worshipped by the Israelites in the desert. And it wasn't put up because people love Miriam Naor. It was put up by a group of people who felt threatened, people who favor settlement, people who were against the consideration of rights of foreign workers, which the Supreme Justice Miriam Naor, with others, voted that the Knesset doesn't have the power to remove them without condition. There has to be a certain process. So people were against that. They put up this statue of Miriam Naor in order for it to be toppled. And it was taken down. So in Israel, they have a very different approach to monuments. And here's another one. Who's that? Somewhat caricatured, but I'd say identifiable. I'll give you a close-up. Benjamin Netanyahu. Again, a golden statue, golden calf, put up by people who represent the left side of the political spectrum in Israel, put up in none other than Rabin Square, somebody they feel who represents the negation of what Rabin was trying to do in terms of the peace process. And again, this was put up as perhaps a public statement, a demonstration of Netanyahu being worshipped by the right as a golden calf and the savior of the nation of Israel. But again, a monument put up in demonstration rather than a monument torn down in demonstration. So a fascinating way that Israelis tend to deal with this issue. We don't have many statues in Israel that are put up for people. It's very rare. It's not part of our culture, not part of our heritage. There are statues such as one of Raoul Wallenberg, among others, but there is a statue that I believe was removed of Moshe Katsav, the former president of Israel who was accused of raping and sexually assaulting, and that statue stood in the president's residence. So there are sometimes issues with figures that we need to reflect on what they've done, regardless of their position, whether president or prime minister, and what we need to do with those monuments to them. But as I said, in Israel, there aren't a lot of such statues to tear down. So now, this is a rather odd photograph. In Tel Aviv, we're at the corner of Ovdan and Yasser Arafat Boulevard. Now, are those official names of those streets? No. Yasser Arafat, I'm sure you're all familiar with. Ovdan means loss. Ovdan, loss in the sense of people killed, lost because of terrorist activities at the hands of Palestinians, etc. So a group of right-wing people put this up, again, as demonstration, kind of the opposite that we're experiencing in other places, both in Canada and the States, but to say, this is what you want, Israel? If you're supporting a weak policy and not dealing with the Palestinians, we should, not getting rid of terrorism, not getting rid of the enemy, fine, this is what you want, this is what you're going to get. And this is, in fact, what we have. We've got Yasser Arafat, and we've got loss as a result. If you're not going to deal with the way we are, you might as well just put up signs in their honor for what they're doing and for the people whose names that is. And of course, this is at the corner of Ben Gurion Street that you can see up here. In Tel Aviv. So a very powerful statement, but putting up a monument as demonstration, not because that monument has legitimacy as itself. It's the last thing that people would want, but they're making a powerful statement about their disagreement with certain policies that are bringing about results that are certainly unfavored. And there are many other examples of street names. I'll give you one example. Again, perhaps an opposite response. Those of you who are familiar with Haifa, we talked about this on our trip a year and a half ago when we visited Haifa with the synagogue group in Israel. We went up a main road going up the mountain in Haifa called Shderot HaTzionut, Zionism Avenue. That was changed back in the 1980s when the United Nations declared Zionism or equated Zionism with racism. It used to be called United Nations Avenue, but Israel, in response to that, saying, you know what, United Nations, you can go whatever yourselves. We're not going to respect, we're not going to have anything naming that institution in our country anymore. We're going to change it exactly, v'nafochu, au contraire. You're equating Zionism with racism, so we're going to put Zionism on a street that was named after you. So again, interesting way that Israelis deal with monuments put up as demonstration rather than torn down because they represent something that they perhaps dislike. So before I sum things up, I want to show you a short clip. I mentioned a few weeks ago that I had watched a series called A New History of the South. And I just wanted, I finished the last of 24 episodes not too long ago, and the lecture had some interesting reflections on the South, but how it is viewed today and how we should be viewing things. And then we'll talk a little bit about these monuments, but I just want, it's about a 5-minute long section. Granted, it deals mostly with the South, but I find it of great relevance because much of what's going on today is inspired, motivated, and informed by what's going on in the United States, particularly as a result of what went on in the South for so many centuries, and not just that culminated in the Civil War, but has gone on today. Values, perspectives that have not died out, and as we talked about before, whether it's the statue of Robert E. Lee, or Andrew Jackson, or Jefferson Davis, or the Ole Miss rebels, a lot of that culture still exists. So, as I said, although it relates specifically to the South, he has a lot of universal comments and conclusions, which I think are going to be of relevance. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to try to share that with you, and hopefully everything will work, sound included. So just give me a moment. Okay, so just let me know when it starts if you can hear it. If there's a problem with the sound, I need to know immediately. So give me 1 second. So I can see on my screen right now, I can't see everybody. I can see Sharon and Barb. So if you guys just give me a thumbs up if the sound comes out, okay?
Enemies. In recent decades, monuments to Confederate heroes that had stood silently for decades suddenly began to speak, saying different things to different listeners. The statues portrayed the history they commemorated in the most flattering light. Like centuries of monuments before them, the men on horseback or standing in vigilant solitude elevated leaders, ennobled soldiers, and celebrated sacrifice. The meanings invested in the Civil War statues of the turn of the century slowly fell silent. Cities of carriages became cities of automobiles. As new wars demanded new sacrifices and new monuments, the Civil War statues faded from view, relics to the passions of increasingly distant decades. The Civil War itself, though more costly in lives than all of America's wars of the 20th century combined, became patronized and sentimentalized as a quieter war, a more human war than the mechanized and anonymous slaughter of modern times. Though the statues spoke less clearly to white Americans over time, Black Southerners remembered what the Confederate statues were meant to say to them. The civil rights struggle confronted them with the resurgence of Confederate flags and celebrations of Confederate heroes. One generation of Black parents after another had to explain to their children why statues of men who had warred against the United States to create a new nation based on perpetual bondage still stood in public places meant to be shared by all citizens. Today, many Americans, unaware of the earlier conversations, express surprise at the intense debates over the monuments. The arguments by those who attack and those who defend the monuments puzzle and annoy people who see the blocks of granite and the horses of bronze as quaint Victorian decorations of public space. To them, the statues seem so much leftover civic furniture, useless and thus harmless. They see no harm in leaving monuments that acknowledge Lee and Jackson as worthy of respect for their character and bravery, their virtues separable from the cause for which they fought. To such Americans, today's fights over Civil War monuments seem to come out of nowhere. But instead, as we've seen in this course, those fights rise out of American and Southern history, a history full of buried force that suddenly surges to the surface when its plates shift. Suppressed memories, stories half told or lied about, carry greater power for having been suppressed. History, apparently fixed, solid, and settled, can suddenly erupt. Cities and towns across America will continue to confront their particular civil war, grappling with what has been forgotten or suppressed where they live. Perhaps some communities will decide that their old memorials can be put to new uses, telling who erected the monuments, quoting the words and showing the images that defined their original purpose. Other communities may decide that the older monuments do more harm than good, and that different sorts of memorials can better speak to our own time and do fuller justice to the past. People who listen to current conversations will discover that the historical record is far richer than the few stories we have chosen from it, more monumental in scale and consequence than the statues we have built to contain it. New kinds of films and histories, new kinds of museums, new voices in our ears, and new images before our eyes will do work that statues alone cannot. The defining event of our nation's history will continue to speak to us if we will listen. As we've seen in this course, there is not a single past. We are constantly changing our minds about the past, finding things that have been there all along but have been invisible because we were not looking for them, or looking past them, or refusing to see them. Given all that has been written and said about the South, we might expect that Americans would be able to think clearly about the region. Yet television, movies, novels, roadside markers, old history books, and jokes tell the same basic stories about the South over and over, even when people know these stories are not true to their own experience or to the complexity of human life. The South has suffered from generalizations that trivialize it. Whether those generalizations take the form of romantic and nostalgic dreams of the past, or arrogant regional stereotypes, or scholarly arguments, positive or negative, these images of the South keep us from seeing the people of the region with the fullness and empathy that all people deserve. Southern history is made up of all the things that have happened and are happening on this artificially bounded piece of real estate, however contradictory they have been and remain. Southern history bespeaks a place that is more complicated than the stories we tell about it. Throughout its history, the South has been a place where poverty and plenty have been thrown together in especially jarring ways, where democracy and oppression, white and black, slavery and freedom have warred. The very story of the South is a story of unresolved identity, unsettled and restless, unsure and defensive. The South, contrary to so many words written in defense and in attack, was not a fixed, known, and unified place, but rather a place of constant movement, constant struggle, and constant negotiation. People sometimes argue that to rethink the past, to revise it, is somehow to betray it. But in fact, we need revisionist history just as we need revisionist science and revisionist medicine. We constantly learn more, see more of the Southern and American past. That is as it should be. And I appreciate.
So I think he has some very interesting points in terms of how we choose to view the past, whether we're courageous enough to take a look at whether you call it revisionist or a more expansive awareness and acknowledgement of what's gone on, looking beyond the symbols and the graphics of what we're familiar with and comfortable with, and going into those areas where we probably would not want to venture because we're afraid, as he suggested, of what we might find there. That has to do with certainly what the Americans are facing right now with their past and their present. Canadians are starting to do that as well. There are many Israelis who are doing that as well, and trying to explore a little bit about the mythological history of many of our past events in the founding of Israel, and to try to take a look at some of the things that occurred while the state was being founded, and certainly things that are going on today. So it's our duty, I would say, if we're courageous enough to take it on, to be open to exploring things that we haven't in the past been willing to explore. The question is whether we're able to step out of our comfort zone with regards to our narrative and our history, and willing to consider how we viewed that history in ways that we haven't really considered before. That's not an easy thing to do. And as I mentioned today, when speaking briefly about Moshe, with regards to this week's Parsha and the whole event of hitting the rock as opposed to speaking to the rock, I said that, as a couple of commentators suggest, it wasn't a punishment for Moshe. It was perhaps a test, throwing new circumstances at Moshe that were somewhat different than some of the issues he dealt with in the past with regards to God and the children of Israel. But he stuck to a certain template and a certain mode of action that wasn't right for those circumstances. He wasn't able or wasn't willing perhaps to see those unique circumstances, that specific case, and deal with it in a way that reflects the kind of leader that a people newly fashioned after 40 years in the desert require. So it was a reality check. And similar today, is our leadership and are we willing to see things in a different way based on current circumstances? I'll just share one last thing with you. Somebody by the name of Douglas Todd has this title for an article last year, actually, already last year, because this issue of statues, as I showed you, has been going on in Canada as well for a few years. So it says this: want to tear down a statue? Try these two tests first. The first metric to consider before removing a statue, sign, or plaque is to determine whether a historical figure has been memorialized primarily for actions now widely considered barbarous, such as blatant racism, reigns of terror, or genocide. And he says, in that way, it makes sense to tear down statues of Stalin, Cambodia's Pol Pot, or Iraq's Saddam Hussein. Perhaps, as many thoughtful people have been arguing since the Charlottesville riots, such reasoning also applies to Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander during the U.S. Civil War, who essentially fought to keep Black people in bondage. The second ethical test centers on discerning whether the actions and beliefs of the historical figure in question were common in their era. We can't expect every person to have stood against slavery in the 1700s or against colonialism in Europe and Canada in the 1800s, when such concepts were the norm. We need to judge whether the accomplishments of such people outweigh their participation in beliefs considered ordinary during their lifetime. It should be clear from these two ethical tests that it was not wise of the Victoria Council, as I mentioned before, to remove the statue of John A. Macdonald. And so, however we decide, whatever criteria we use to determine whether these symbols of a past with which today we have trouble identifying need to be removed, or as even some Black leaders say, and Indigenous leaders in Canada suggest, those need to be maintained because they reflect a period of our history. If we eliminate those statues, we eliminate the opportunity and the possibility that next generations will understand something about what was important to us in an earlier time. It perhaps is a painful reminder and embarrassing, if not awkward at best, to be reminded of what we have done in the past to other people. Yet, I would suggest, as others do, that having those reminders in front of us in some appropriate way keeps us on our toes and ensures that the values we now claim to profess are in fact put into practice and maintained, and will have people who see those symbols as reminders to make sure that we're doing what we claim we want to do. So whether those statues and other symbols, street signs as well, are left where they are with an additional sign beside them of explanation, presenting other perspectives, or whether those items are placed into a museum, an art gallery, which they have been in the past. You go through any museum, you'll find things that reflect horrible things done in the past by a whole array of leaders, as recently as this century, of course. So we have to decide where the best place for those monuments might be. knowing that it's going to be painful for us to see it, knowing that it's going to be perhaps more than painful for those who are the objects of racism or colonialism perpetrated by those figures, but we need to be reminded. We can't take the chance and go for a knee-jerk reaction of simply tearing things down that make us uncomfortable or because groups demand that it be done to serve their immediate interests. We need to think of the long term, and of course that long term is continued education about our past and understanding how we don't repeat those mistakes. So I'm happy to open it up to comments now. Perhaps just raise your hand before you speak so we can do it that way.